I was a doctoral student in Denver, sitting in the back of a board meeting, when I watched the thing this whole season has been building toward happen in real time, in about 9 seconds. A group of community representatives was presenting. They were laying out the findings of the people I had spent years reading: Geneva Gay, William Tate, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Linda Darling-Hammond, Angela Valenzuela, the very scholars I told you about last time. I was sitting there proud because this was my intellectual family, and their work had a kind of authority to me that I could feel in my chest. I had read them. I could see my own life inside their work. I had already decided I wanted to become that kind of scholar. But in the boardroom that day, I realized the world did not have that same view. When the community representatives finished, a board member leaned forward and asked, "Where's the data?" One of the presenters said, "This is the data." And the board member said, "Where are the numbers?" Silence. I have carried that silence for over 25 years. Everything I am going to tell you in this episode comes out of it. Welcome to the cultural context of knowledge. I am your host, Donald Easton-Brooks. This is Season 3, The Inheritance Tax, and this is Episode 8. Last time I told you about the generation of scholars who built a science out of what our communities already knew. Michelle Foster at the kitchen tables, Tsianina Lomawaima with the Kalako elders, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, Lisa Delpit, Carol Lee, James Banks, Luis Mall and Norma Gonzalez in Mexican homes in Tucson, Angela Valenzuela in Houston, Stacy Lee in Philadelphia. I told you they proved it, past any honest doubt, in the language of story. And I ended by telling you there was one thing they had not yet done. They had not put a number on it that a legislature could not wave away. This is the episode where that happens. And I have to tell it to you personally, because I am one of the people it happened to. Part 1. The question that would not leave. A few weeks after that board meeting, I was sitting in a class when a classmate gave a presentation citing the work of Christopher Swanson from the Urban Institute's Education Policy Center. Swanson had looked at the graduating class of 2001 and concluded that the country had been overstating how many students actually finish high school. So he built his own measure, using the Federal Common Core of data, and he called it the Cumulative Promotion Index. Here is what that measure did. It followed students grade to grade and asked how likely a 9th grader was to walk out 4 years later with a regular diploma. It did not count a GED. It did not count the other pathways students take to finish. He pointed to No Child Left Behind as the reason for drawing the line that way, and the picture he produced was brutal. Nationally, about 68%. So the high school graduate for white students was about 75%, for black students 50%, for Native students 51%, for Mexican and other Latino students 53%, and for Asian students 77%. Now sit with that black number, 50%. Half. The claim in that classroom in that era was that 1 out of every 2 black children in this country did not finish high school. And I want to be careful here, because this is the exact place where the season's argument lives. I am not going to tell you Swanson was a bad researcher or that he set out to harm anyone. I am telling you what happened when I, a black man from a black neighborhood in Texas, heard that number. Culturally, I could not make it fit, because in the black community, high school graduation is a celebrated event. It is a whole occasion. Family drives in. People take off work. So I did something that was not, at that moment, a research method. It was just a man trying to reconcile a number with his life. I started counting. Every black person I knew, I asked one simple question. Tell me the number of people you know who did not graduate from high school. And the highest answer anybody gave me was around 30%. That is when I understood that I was still in the long shadow of the Coleman Report. Not the study itself, but what it taught the country to expect. A field so accustomed to documenting what was broken in us that a number claiming half of us failed could be repeated by educated people without anyone stopping to ask whether it was true. And it was not only black children. Those were the years when everyone was talking about the black and white achievement gap and the Mexican and white achievement gap. But look again at Swanson's own figures. Asian students finished at 77%, white students at 75%. There was a white and Asian gap sitting right there in the same table, and almost nobody called it a gap or built a research industry around fixing white students. Later, when Amy Shin and Yu Xie published their work showing that the Asian advantage traced mainly to academic effort rather than to anything innate, people still went looking for a twist and kept steering the conversation to math when the pattern ran across the board. The word gap, it turns out, is not a measurement. It is a decision about who needs explaining. There was one more thing I could not shake. My own doctoral chair, Alan Davis, had done a study with Denver Public Schools and found a 6-point difference favoring black students. So the question would not leave me. Where is the data? I decided the only way to answer people like that board member was to stand in front of them and speak their language. I took every statistics course I could possibly take. Not because I had stopped believing the stories, because I intended to bring a cultural context into a place that had never had one. Part 2. Bringing a cultural lens to the numbers. My dissertation at the University of Colorado at Denver was called Using Socioeconomic Indicators to Predict the Academic Outcomes of African American Students. I went into a national dataset, and I went to the transcripts, the actual record of what students completed, and what I found was a different outcome than the one in that classroom presentation. In my analysis, black students finished at 59% and white students at 72%, 9 points higher for black students than the widely cited estimate, 4 points lower for white students. Same children, same time, a different answer because of choices somebody made about how to count. So let me show you the choices, because this is the cultural lens applied to a number instead of to a story. Start with what he chose not to count. No GED, no alternative pathway. In communities where a young person may work a job, help raise a sibling, and finish on a different road, a rule that counts only the 4-year diploma does not merely measure those students, it erases the ways they actually get there. Then look at which states were in the data at all. To calculate a 4-year rate the way he did, a state had to report 4 straight years of data to the federal collection, and not every state did. When I went through which states were missing, I found Texas, Florida, Washington, D.C., North Carolina, and South Carolina among them. Now hold that against the census of that era. Texas and Florida were 2 of only 4 states with 2 million or more black residents. Between 2000 and 2003, more black people moved to Florida than to any other state. Washington, D.C. was about 60% black. South Carolina had one of the highest black population in the country, and more than half of the black population in the United States lived in the South. So a study about black graduation was built on a map with much of black life left off it. That is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and more ordinary. When the people designing a measure do not live inside the community the measure is about, the holes in it are invisible to them and obvious to us. That is the whole argument of this show, standing in a spreadsheet. Part 3. The variable finally gets a name. While that argument over graduation rates was running through the early 2000s, something else landed. In 2004, an economist named Thomas D. published a study in the Review of Economics and Statistics using a randomized experiment, the Tennessee Class Size Study, where students and teachers had been assigned to classrooms by chance. That random assignment let him ask a question the field had never been able to answer cleanly. What happens when a student has a teacher of their own race? His answer: Black students taught by Black teachers scored significantly higher in both math and reading. Read that against everything in this season. The variable nobody wrote down for a century. The column that was missing. In 2004, in the most rigorous design the field had, it finally showed up as a variable. And here is the part that still gets me. Not many people were listening. I was finishing my Ph.D. around then, deciding what kind of scholar I wanted to be. And I made a choice that came directly from the people I told you about last episode. I decided my research agenda would focus on what was working for students of color, rather than on what was not working. That was not my invention. That was Foster and Ladson-Billings and Mall and Gonzalez and Valenzuela teaching me where to point the lens. They studied what worked. I would do the same, with different tools. And I had a question of my own that would not sit still. I would go back to Texas, to the neighborhood I grew up in, and I would keep meeting people from those same blocks who had gone on to earn doctorates. Nothing in the deficit literature explained my street. Only one thing did. The variable. The one that had been hidden for so many years. When I read D's work closely, I saw that his window was small, mostly the earliest grades. I had spent my doctoral years working with large national datasets, and I had training in hierarchical modeling, in longitudinal analysis, in latent class analysis. So I leaned into the data to ask whether what he found held up past kindergarten. I partnered with Chance Lewis and Yubo Zhang, and in 2009, we published Ethnic Matching, the influence of African American teachers on the reading scores of African American students. 2 years later, with Colleen Eddy, I published a study in urban education following ethnic matching and mathematics achievement from kindergarten through 5th grade. Part 4, What It Costs to Ask. Now I want to tell you the part that does not usually make it into the citation. It was hard to find a place for that work. From some qualitative scholars, the response was essentially, tell us something we did not already know. And they were not wrong that the communities knew. That is this whole season. From some quantitative scholars, the objection was stranger. One of them told me the work was not serious because I had cited more qualitative researchers than quantitative ones. That was a literal response I received. Think about what that says. The evidence of 100 years, gathered by the people who lived it, counted against me. And then it came from inside my own building. In an annual evaluation, my department chair and my dean told me that if I continued this line of research, I would not be taken seriously. I want you to sit in that with me for a second, because I was an untenured professor with a family. On one hand, I knew the work was right. It made sense in the data, and it made sense culturally, which to me is a higher bar, not a lower one. On the other hand, was the plain arithmetic of a career. Do I pivot to get tenure, or do I take the chance? That is the tax this season is named for, arriving in my own life in a performance review with a mortgage to pay. What changed it was a person. I met Dr. Richard Milner, who was coming in as editor of Urban Education. He looked at the work, and he saw it, and he believed in it, and he told me to keep going. That is the whole difference. Not a new method, not a better data set. One established scholar deciding that this question was worth the space in his journal. If you have ever wondered whether a single person in a position to open a door actually matters, I am standing here because of one. And I thank Brother Milner for this. Part 5. What the numbers say now. So let me answer that board member, 25 years later. Where is the data? Here is the data. For Black students, the finding is now among the strongest and most consistent in all of education research, and the people who built it deserve their names. Thomas D. opened the door in 2004. I came right after him. In 2009, with Chance Lewis and Yubo Zhang, I published the reading study. In 2011, with Colleen Eddy, I followed mathematics from kindergarten through 5th grade, and what we found was cumulative. The more years a Black student spends with a Black teacher, the bigger the advantage in their trajectory. Then the rest of the field arrived. Anna Egelite, Brian Kissada, and Marcus Winters came in 2015. Christopher Redding gathered the whole literature into a review in 2019 and found the pattern holding across study after study. Huang, Graf, and Behrens showed that timing and frequency matter, that when a child gets a matched teacher, and how often, changes the size of what they gain. It is not a one-study fluke, and it does not fade. And Seth Gershenson and his colleagues took the longest view of all, finding that a Black student who has a Black teacher in the early elementary grades is more likely to finish high school and more likely to enroll in college. A relationship in 1st grade, showing up a decade later in whether a young person walks onto a campus. For Mexican and other Latino students, the evidence has strengthened in the same direction, in reading and in mathematics. Travis Bristol and Martin Fernandez put a number on it, measuring the added value that Latino and Black teachers bring to Latino and Black students. David Blazar and Francisco Lagos widened the question past the classroom teacher to the professional staff across a whole building. Zhang found the effect holding in urban, suburban, and rural high schools alike, and researchers have extended it to students who are learning in 2 languages, where you might expect the benefit to be about language alone. It is not. When the teacher shares the student's bilingual world, the gains show up in mathematics and other subjects too. The mechanism is relational and cultural, not merely linguistic. The child is not just being translated, the child is being known. For Asian students, everything depends on refusing to treat an entire continent as one category. Stacey Lee showed that the quiet success story hides enormous variation, and I learned the same thing firsthand, sitting on an ethnic think tank convened by Washington State's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. In the Seattle area alone, there are more than 16 distinct Asian communities. In 2008, the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs stated it clearly in a report titled Asian Americans in Washington State, Closing Their Hidden Achievement Gaps. Look at 10th grade mathematics in Seattle public schools in 2007 and 2008. Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students scored well above the Asian average. Cambodian, Hmong, Mien, and Laotian students scored nearly 18% below it. One category. 18 points of difference living inside it. The same fracture shows up in language, where the share of students still learning English ran around 24% for Japanese students and near 66% for Vietnamese and Hmong students. When you report only the average, you erase both ends of it, and you miss the children who most need to be seen. Now put ethnic matching on top of that picture. In 2015, Anna Egelite, Brian Kissada, and Marcus Winters followed the entire population of test-taking students in Florida public schools, grades 3 through 10, across 8 years, and asked what happens to a child's achievement when the teacher shares their race. They found significant gains in mathematics for Black, white, and Asian students. But here is the part almost nobody quotes. The single largest gain they measured anywhere in that study, larger than for any other group, was for Asian students in mathematics in grades 6 through 10, when an Asian teacher stood at the front of the class. Sit with that. Egelite and her colleagues found the biggest match effect of the entire study in the one group the country had already decided did not need help. And it fits exactly what the Seattle data would predict. A matched teacher matters most for students from communities with more recent immigration histories and less generational experience inside U.S. schools. A child from a long-established, well-resourced community may do fine no matter who teaches them. A Hmong or Cambodian child whose family is newer to the country and to its schools needs someone at the front of the classroom who already knows their world. That is what ethnic matching is. The more unfamiliar the institution, the more a matched teacher can carry the child. For Native students, I have to be honest about the state of the evidence, because honesty is the point of this episode. The research base is smaller. Part of that is population size. Part of it is that disaggregating across hundreds of distinct tribal nations is a methodological problem most studies have not solved, and lumping Native students into one category repeats the exact error we just named with Asian students. Conrad Gist and Travis Bristol did something about that when they built the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers, putting Indigenous teachers in the title instead of folding them into somebody else's category. What the existing research does show consistently is that Native students who have teachers who understand and respect their cultural and community context, whether or not that teacher shares their specific tribal nation, show stronger engagement and stronger performance. And for these students, the match carries something extra because their communities faced a federal program built to erase their languages and their nations. An educator who supports cultural continuity is not offering an accommodation. That teacher is answering a specific historical harm, one we sat with back in episode 3. And the newest work has moved past test scores entirely, which I think is overdue. Jamimi Young and I built a framework for what a teacher of color does for a student's sense of belonging. Matthew Sherrill, Travis Bristol, and Talani Britton studied exclusionary discipline in New York City and found the effect for Asian, Black, and Latino students alike. Michael Gottfried and his colleagues found that high school students with the same race teacher simply attend class more often. Cassandra Hart and Constance Lindsay found that a matched teacher changes whether a child gets identified at all for the services schools hand out at their discretion. And Jason Grissom and Christopher Redding found that same pattern in who gets recommended for gifted programs, which is exactly where Donna Ford has been pointing the field for years. Show up, be seen, get referred. None of that is a test score, and all of it is a life. I also have to give you the complications, because a finding you only tell one way is a slogan. Researchers have documented what the field now calls the diversity tax, the extra cultural and emotional labor loaded onto teachers of color who become the counselor, the family liaison, and the translator for a whole school on top of teaching a full load. Abiola Farindawu documented what that costs Black women teachers and why they leave. Kari Koka followed teachers of color in an under-resourced urban school to ask what actually keeps them there. McCarthy and his colleagues found that this congruence even changes a teacher's own risk of stress. There is a real risk of essentialism, of treating a teacher's identity as a stand-in for their skill, and there is the danger of tokenistic hiring, where a school brings in teachers of color, gives them no support, and then watches them leave. The match is not a substitute for building a school worth staying in, which brings me to right now, and I am not going to dress it up. In the last few years, an organized political effort has worked to dismantle the equity infrastructure that districts spent years building. Laws restricting how race can be discussed in classrooms, offices closed, diversity hiring goals challenged and in places prohibited. Grow your own teacher programs that were funded through those budget lines losing their money. Teacher preparation programs pressured to strip culturally responsive practice out of the curriculum. And I want to name what that argument is, because I have heard it before. The claim that equity work is ideology rather than a response to documented inequity is not new. It is the same argument made against desegregation, the same one made against multicultural education. The research in this episode makes that argument wrong. But being wrong has never stopped an argument from winning when the people who translate research into policy prefer a different conclusion. So here is where I have landed after 25 years. That board member's question was fair, whereas the data is a fair thing to ask. What was not fair was that the answer he received, the lived and documented knowledge of entire communities, did not count as an answer until people like me spent a decade rebuilding it in his language. The numbers were never the problem. The problem was who got to decide what counted as a number and whose life had to be translated before it could be believed. I did that translation. I would do it again. But I want to be clear about what it costs and about who paid it, because that is the tax this season is named for. This week, take one statistic you have heard repeated about a community, any community, and go find out how it was built, not whether you agree with it, how it was made, who was counted, who was left out, which states or schools or years made it into the dataset, and what the people who designed it decided not to count. You do not need statistics training to ask those questions. You need to be willing to ask them out loud, because the number is never just a number. It is a set of decisions somebody made, and somebody's life is on the other side of it. So where does that leave us? We have the data now. The variable that went unwritten for a century has a name, a method, and a shelf of studies behind it, and a generation of scholars who keep telling the story. In Florida and New York and Seattle and everywhere researchers have looked, we answered the board member, where is the data? Here it is. But I want to be honest, because this season has been honest all the way through. Having the data is not the same as finishing the work. The country still fills its classrooms with children of color and staffs them with a teaching force that does not look like them. The match we can now measure so precisely is still, for most of these children, missing from their day. That is why the newest chapter of my own work, with Jamimi Young and Devin Williams, is titled Still Searching for a Match. Still, after everything in this episode, we went back to revisit ethnic matching in urban education through the lens of equity, history, and place. Because the question is no longer whether the match works. We have settled that. The question now is why. Knowing what we know, we still have not built the hiring, the schools, and the pathways that would put a matched teacher in front of every child who needs one. Looking through history, we understand how we got here. Looking through place, we find where the gap runs widest. Looking through equity, we name what we owe. And that word still is the honest one. This is where we are going, not to prove the point one more time, but to close the distance between what the research has known for years and what a child actually walks into on a Monday morning. The data was never the hard part. Thank you for listening to The Cultural Context of Knowledge. I am Donald Easton-Brooks, and this is Season 3, The Inheritance Tax. See you next time. Three things before we close. If this episode mattered to you, share it with someone. If this episode gave you something worth passing on, pass it on. You can find me wherever you listen to podcasts. episode companions, and the work behind the work are at podcast.donaldeastonbrooks.com. Thank you for listening. I am Dr. Donald Easton-Brooks, and this is the cultural context of knowledge.